Welcome to the Archive Room podcast.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Fastamai, Judith Lay here, welcoming you to the Archive Room, Manx Radio's treasure chest of stories of island life from years gone by, told by the people who were there. And a familiar sound will give you a clue to what I have for you in this programme, as I take another look on the shelf marked Tourist Trophy. Well, another TT is over, and as new records are set and new champions get that prized podium finish, we're rounding off this year's festival with another nostalgic look at the TT races in years gone by. Today, the TT is all about bikes, but that's not how it started, and the first races had nothing at all to do with speed. Prepare to have your TT knowledge fully expanded as journalist and renowned TT commentator Geoff Cannell gives a potted history of the TT to David Callister. The year is 2007, the centenary year of the TT, and Geoff is telling David that year's festival will begin with a complete reenactment of the first motorbike race held on the 28th of May 1907.
There's going to be staged a complete reenactment of the first ever TT, which was held that day, starting at 10 o'clock. And this year we're going to have 100 machines to mark the centenary, doing 2 laps of the original Peel course, which was from St John's to Ballacrane, turn left and follow the present course through Glen Helen to Kirkmichael, turn left and along the Peel Coast Road, past Knocksherry into Peel, and then back out along the road to Ballalease Bridge and through to St John's. 10 laps, 15 miles a lap, with a quarter of an hour stop in the middle for refuelling and refreshments.
And the speeds they'd reach would be?
Well, the average speed was about 50, so the bikes would be doing 65 towards 70, but that was tremendous on those bone shakers. And the riders will be riding replica machines or actual machines from the relative period in this reenactment, and there's a lot of work going into it. The roads will be closed, and period costumes will be worn. There'll be a parade. There's going to be proper commentary on the Tynwell Green, and everything will be as near as we can get it to that day 100 years before.
But of course there was road racing, I think, on that same course, wasn't there, prior to the TT itself?
Well, the cars and the bikes both came in 1905 as part of trials for a European Championship. The cars actually went from Quarterbridge to Castletown and then up the Ballymorda Straight to Ballacrane, along the present TT course to Ballaugh, turned left there to the Cronk, and then right along the Ballamore Straight and into Ramsey and then over the mountain. The bikes were thought could do it, but they tried it and the bikes couldn't get up the mountain. So the bikes did the loop down to Castletown, up the Ballamorda Straight to Ballacrane, and then they turned right then and went the reverse direction of the present TT course through Crosby and back to Douglas.
What size engine would these bikes be in these early days?
Well, it wasn't particularly the size of them, and they were either twin-cylinder machines or single-cylinder machines. But the main thing about the early TTs was that you were only allocated a certain amount of petrol. It was a fuel consumption test. And in fact, they got incredible averages, over 100 to the gallon out of these things. But in the very first year, they were so lacking in performance, some of them had to push up Craig Willys, and some of them pedalled up. But they banned pedals after the first year. But it was quite something to ride those old crocs round there and at the speeds they were doing.
Somebody'd have to open the gates on the mountain as well, would they then?
Well, they weren't using the mountain then on the Peel course, of
right.
course. But later on, yes, they most certainly did have people up. They paid shepherds to actually open the gates. And if you go to Keppel Gate Corner now, behind the Marshal's shelter, there's the original gate post, which says Keppel Gate on it, but it wasn't there. Keppel Gate originally was at Kate's Cottage.
Was it?
One of the original slate posts is actually in the ground there. You can go and see it and take a photograph of it. But the Peel course lasted only for 4 years, and then they decided then that the mountain course, the bikes could do the mountain course, but it was quite something to get up the mountain on those bikes, and they had to stop and change tyres and put inner tubes in, change belts. In fact, they used to have boxes of sand on the uphills on the mountains, so as the riders could stop and put sand on the leather belts to make them grip better, because they would get oil and grease on them.
And would they be able to ride in wet conditions? Because the roads would be mud virtually, weren't they?
Oh, yes. Well, they put some special stuff down one year to try and lay the dust, and it was an acid. What they didn't know was that mixed with water created a mixture which all the riders' leathers just all went into tatters and
Really?
got in the riders' eyes and everything. It was only done the one such thing. No blooming wonder.
Yeah.
But, it was quite something to go up the mountain at 1911, but Oliver Godfrey still managed over 50 mile an hour average speed then. The cars, meanwhile, had cut out the southern loop, and they were coming from Quarterbridge on the present TT course to Ballacrane and then straight on to Peel. And then they cut out the Cronk loop, so there were about 4 or 5 different versions of the TT.
And this is where we get the name Gordon Bennett from these early days, isn't it?
Yeah, they were trials for the British team to represent the country in the European Championship, in France usually.
Yeah.
And he put the Isle of Man forward, and of course the Isle of Man could close the roads, which he couldn't do in Britain.
Well, that's right. Tynwald agreed to that, didn't they? I think.
Put emergency legislation through to create the possibility of shutting the public roads. But of course, for many years for the TT, the roads weren't closed for practising. Not until 1927. They were just run on open roads, the practising, until Archie Birkin was killed when he encountered a fish cart at Kirkmichael and was killed trying to avoid it. And they said, this must not happen. We must shut the roads for the practices as well. Yeah. And another thing that's not remembered too often is there was a complete fortnight's practising for the TT, not just a week, before the races ever got going, because you couldn't practice in the evenings. It was all morning practices, and you would get a complete fortnight of it before the races actually took place.
It must have been great for those early TT pioneers, though, mustn't it? But they wouldn't have had vast crowds coming over to watch those races, would they, do you think?
No, nobody came for the practices, even in the 50s. No one was here for the practices. They all came for the races, and it was deserted, the place, in practice week. But when the old crocks were riding, I mean, the riders had to be lifted off at the end. They were so exhausted, and it was more like a motocross, really, I suppose. They had certainly, even when my father was riding, he certainly had big canvas belts around their waist to try and hold everything in. Such a bone-shaking experience.
Right.
And until 1935, they ran regardless of the weather. They didn't postpone the races, and there were some horrendous trips over the mountain for the riders when they couldn't see across the road. And one chap was actually lost completely, and he couldn't be found. He'd crashed hours earlier and was dead, and they didn't know.
Really?
And they just found him eventually. And of course, even those who crashed and weren't too badly injured couldn't be rescued by any means other than by being stretchered, which of course involved a terrific walk from places like the East Mountain Gate, and then they would take them down on the MER to Laxey, and then on the MER to Douglas, and then pick up an ambulance in Douglas. And it would be 4 hours after the crash before the rider reached hospital, and many must have been lost through that. There were 1 or 2 occasions when, in fact, the ambulance was permitted to go on the course if it was really serious, but it was only done with extreme caution.
Who were the first early Manx riders?
Tom Sheard was the one. He won twice in successive years, and he was the only Manxman to win the TT until Neil Kelly won in 1967. And so that was a long period from about 1923-24, I think, to then. And then Dave Molyneux won the sidecars and has been winning ever since. And Milky Quayle, Richard Quayle, he won the TT as well. So not all that many really have triumphed.
Your father rode, did he ride in the TT himself?
Well, he rode in the Clubman's TT, which wasn't quite the full international event, but he did the Manx Grand Prix from 1932, I think, to 47 inclusive, and he got some replicas, 6 replicas.
He was also one of the stunt riders on No Limit, of course, and No Limit must have had an influence on the TT to some extent. I mean, I know it was a comedy, but it would have helped to publicise the TT over the years, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't know whether all the publicity was helpful or not, because
No.
when you look at it now, it's an absolutely horrendous event. People going on fire and riding over cliffs and all sorts of things, and bodies lying in the road, riders going over the top of them. I don't suppose you'd allow it now, but it was a great theme, and it certainly did give publicity to the TT in the fact that people saw what the races were like, because if you look closely at the Formby film, lots of the actual races are cut into it. Between the comedy bits, there's actual pieces of the races. Yeah. And as you can slow them down now on DVDs and things, you can actually see the Edward Pier being built in the background.
Really?
And quite a lot of contemporary hotels and things which are no longer there. So it's a historical film.
Absolutely,
of the
yes. The location for spectators has changed a lot as well, because people used to sit on hedges, stand on road edges and all sorts of things in the past.
If you see the old photographs of Ballacrane, the people used to stand in the road, like in a sort of semicircle, around the road towards St John's. No barrier or anything. There would be a rope, I suppose. Yeah. And they were right in the firing line. Unbelievable. And the speeds then, they'd be coming to Ballacrane doing nearly 100 in those days. So if something went wrong, I think they just hoped that the crowd would part like the Red Sea. But I never heard of any serious accidents. When I was marshalling in the 50s and 60s, you weren't allowed to have your legs over the hedge on the course side. You always had to sit with your back to the audience, as it were, sort of thing. But then it slipped a bit and people were going in silly positions. But since the accident at Kirkmichael a few years ago, there's been a great attention to safety now, and lots of areas have been made barred to spectators.
Because the other aspect of the TT is the reporting of death to the riders and the death to visitors and so on. There's always a newspaper somewhere playing up that.
Well, they don't come and report the races. They only get interested if there's a few fatalities, and then they come trekking over. But yeah, it happens from time to time. Then they move on. I mean, there's 120 people being killed in the Alps this skiing season, but it just doesn't get the same. There's something about it that seems to make them flock to the island when there is tragedy.
TT expert Geoff Cannell.
So that was the early days of the races. Now let's see what we can find out about early days of radio coverage of the action on the TT course. It was respected Manx company T.H. Coburn who gave Manx Radio some technical assistance. And here's David Callister again discussing those early days with Manx Radio's managing director of the time, John Grierson.
A link-up was made to Colburn's round the course loudspeaker system for the TT of that year.
Yes.
And that was actually broadcast through help of, I think, one of the sons who set that up, one of his Colburn's sons. But there were huge gaps in that transmission because there were commentators, if you'd call them commentators, but there was long silences, wasn't there?
Well, there had to be. Apart from anything else, you couldn't hear anything apart from the howl of the motorcycle, so it didn't really matter that there were silences because they were filled with the noise of engines. But yeah, it absolutely astonishing things that we were able to do for the TT commentary. I mean, I'd call it the commentary because that's what I thought it was, and I still do. And yeah, we had people around different parts, at obvious places like Belough Bridge and key points in the Isle of Man. But what happened, we managed to hijack some of the BT telephone lines. And thank goodness now it's Manx Telecom, and that's all part in the past, okay? So they can't get at us. But the BT were unaware of the fact that we actually hijacked their lines from the phone boxes. We went round the back of the phone boxes. I won't tell you how we did it because that really would be naughty. And we connected up to the phone lines in the phone boxes. And in one particular point, what we had was Charlie Webster there with a bag of pennies, and he was feeding pennies into the slot to keep us going from those particular phone boxes, which were then feeding a signal, not to the telephone network, but to Manx Radio. It was absolutely wonderful stuff. But now, let me just cap that by telling you, after this was all over, and remember the BBC came over with their Pantechnicons and their enormous outside broadcast units, right? Yeah. Fantastic. A bloke from the BBC in Liverpool phoned me up and he said, I'd like to come over and just have a look at you lot. So I said, fine, got nothing to hide, come and see us. So he sat down, and I won't use the words that he used, but the gist of it was, how did you manage to do that? I'll leave you to imagine what he actually said. Right? And we said, well, I'm afraid we probably can't tell you. But he said, your commentary was every bit as good as ours was. In fact, from a timing point of view, it was better than ours was. And I said, yes, it was, wasn't it? How did that come about? I said, well, I'm not sure that I should be able to tell you that. And I didn't tell him, but I know what happened. The timekeeper in the grandstand, we positioned Charlie down below on ground level. The timekeeper would write down the times and feed them to Charlie down through a slot in the window. I'm not kidding, okay? And so we got the times before the BBC did. And they were aghast when we told them this. Back came, but we are the national broadcaster. I said, well, to hell with you. We beat you to it anyway. And, of course, that was the beauty of knowing the local people. and using the facilities we had.
And later, of course, as it extended and the TT broadcast became very important here, the BBC drifted away from them then, didn't do it.
Well, why would they? We had absolutely sewn the thing up by then.
Manx Radio's first managing director, John Grierson, talking there with David Callister. So, we've heard about the early races, the early broadcasts, but what about riders? Well, I'm afraid I don't know exactly when this next conversation took place. I think it's probably somewhere in the mid to late 1980s. But what I do know is that Geoff Cannell is chatting with Stanley Woods, who was a TT winner in the 1930s, before the outbreak of the Second World War.
Well, Stanley Woods, it's great to welcome you back to the Isle of Man and to talk to Manx Radio. And this machine here, the Veloset, you must enjoy seeing it getting set back up for another run on the runway.
Indeed I do, and it's a great pleasure for me to be back here in the Isle of Man after all these years.
The Veloset, of course, you rode that with great success over here on the mountain circuit.
That was the brainchild that we hoped to challenge the might of the German industry with, but unfortunately it wasn't ready in time.
Also, of course, the war years did intervene, and later on the design for which this was created was outlawed, wasn't it?
It was indeed, yes. They banned supercharging.
You're back on the Isle of Man. Are you getting the TT atmosphere again? Can you feel it still like it always was?
Very definitely. Stronger than ever, I think. Really.
It's great to see so many people coming over still for an event that, when you first came over, was so much different in its speed and its conception.
Well, different in its speed, yes, but not its conception. I mean, it was then and still is a sporting event, the premier sporting event of the motorcycling world.
What did you think of Steve Hislop's 120 miles an hour lap in practice the other night?
Really fantastic. But I went round the course yesterday afternoon by car, and even since 1983, when I was last here, I can see the tremendous improvements to road surface and the easing of bends, so that I suppose an improvement in speed is to be expected.
But in fact it adds to the mental concentration. It was more physical in your days. You were shaken to absolutely smithereens, weren't you?
Well, not if you trained properly for it, but the strain was there, the mental strain was there and is still there. I don't know what the physical strain is like nowadays. I think it must be considerably less with the improvement in control, brakes, road holding, tyres, and of course, above all, road surfaces make life so much easier. Must do.
But nevertheless, it is a tremendous speed. But I'm sure you recall people saying 30 years ago that the TT was getting too fast, and they're still saying it. What would you say to that now?
Well, I remember when the course was first lapped at 60 miles an hour, the greybeards, men of my age nowadays, or maybe 20 years less, said, oh, the limit has been reached. It's going far, the machines are far too fast, reduce the capacity. These comments have been going on year after year. Well, not every year, but from time to time they crop up that the machines are getting too fast. In my opinion, the machines will never get too fast for the top men, but there'll only be a handful of men at the top that can handle those machines, and that's life, I suppose.
Must give you great pleasure, though, that so many people want to talk to you about the old days and still revere you and give you the pleasure of recalling the days, even though you can't ride now.
Well, I wouldn't be human if I didn't enjoy it, I suppose. But it is wonderful to come back and sort of bask in the sunlight of my ancient popularity.
Stanley Woods, a TT winner in the 1930s. In part one of this nostalgic look at the TT races, which, if you missed it, is still available as a podcast, we heard Brian Mylchreest talking about driving the Roads Open car, which he did for the first time in 1947 and for many years afterwards. In 1977, Brian's son David moved into the driving seat, and this is what he told David Callister about his years doing one of the most sought-after TT duties.
Is there a set of rules involved in this roads opening, and where do you get instruction to go and open the roads?
The instruction comes from the clerk of the course, and in the days when I started, it was always done by a handwritten memo. So the clerk of the course would write a little note saying, please proceed to open the roads. The note would be handed to a travelling marshal, who'd bring it down to St Ninians and hand it to the driver of the car. And on receipt of the note, you set off. Nowadays, of course, we have radio contact with the control tower, and we're directed from the clerk of the course by radio.
And is it the intention you go as fast as you possibly can?
No, it's not. People think it is, but when you realise that we travel the course probably in twice the time it takes the quick bikes. So whilst we're going quickly, the emphasis really has to be on safety. We're not using racing cars or rally cars, we're using standard production road cars, and the idea is to get round smoothly and safely.
Of course, the models that go around now are much changed from your father's time, I guess. What do you have any particular favourite vehicles that you've taken?
Well, yes, of course, they're very different. I mean, in his day, I mean, he would reckon a car that would do 100 miles an hour flat out in a straight line would be really fast, whereas nowadays, the equivalent car is probably doing 130, 140 miles an hour in places. So the cars are much quicker. Equally, they handle better, they've got better brakes, so they're more suitable in many ways, and probably easier to drive than those cars were too.
Have you carried some VIPs around?
Yes, I have. I think that probably three of the most interesting people I've taken round, heading the list has to be Prince William, who I took round 3 years ago now, and that was a really interesting trip, and it was very nice to talk to somebody who clearly was very keen on the TT and motorbikes. I've also taken Murray Walker round, and he commentated the whole way round, so that was good fun. And I suppose another interesting person who almost told me how to do it was John Surtees.
Oh, right.
And that was enjoyable as well.
So he was telling you what to do at the bends, was he?
Oh, he was, definitely. I mean, he obviously had been a top biker and also a Grand Prix Formula One world champion, so he knew how to handle a car. And I think he thought that my driving perhaps wasn't quite as good as his.
David Mylchreest reflecting on his experiences of driving the road's open car, and he mentioned having John Surtees as one of his memorable VIP passengers. Motorcycle champion and Formula One world champion John Surtees himself speaking at a reception in his honour at the town hall hosted by the Mayor of Douglas in the summer of 1993.
It's a special day for me to welcome Mr. John Surtees, MBE. He's a great sportsman. To be world motorcycle champion and car Formula One, it'll never be done again. Tremendous achievement, what he has done. He's a thorough gentleman. I'd like to just present Mr. Surtees with a plaque and a tie from the Douglas councillors and the people, and hope you're back in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Mayor, this would appear to be an opportune moment to say a few thank yous on my own behalf. Well, it took me 41 years to get to the Manx Grand Prix. They wouldn't have me in the days when I was a youngster striving to sort of become an international road racer. But 41 years later, they've at least allowed me to come along and come to what is, to my mind, such a special event. I've only been here since Tuesday. But what has impressed me is the way that everything has clicked into place, but in such a relaxed way. People seem to really be enjoying it, and it's a real pleasure to find people, and particularly people such as yourself, Mr. Mayor, in positions such as you hold, welcoming motorcyclists. It's nice to see that this has never changed in the Isle of Man since the days when I was here. I have fond and other memories sort of my races in the Isle of Man, but one thing is for certain, is that racing in the Isle of Man is something special. It is right that full international racing at world championship levels does not still take place here. This is not speaking against the island, but times do change, and unfortunately machines have developed to the point where this circuit is obviously no longer suitable for world championship type events. But
It has that very special position, which, to my mind, will allow the events and, in fact, the authorities here and the motorcycle movement to go hand in glove, and not purely from a point of view of the mainland, but from the point of view of the whole motorcycling world, in that the tremendous nostalgia which surrounds this event, I think, guarantees its future. And we've seen the results of the classic racing and a tremendous interest that is created here. I'm sure that it augurs well for the future. I'd like to thank the club officials who have been so helpful to me. Nothing was too much trouble. It's been a wonderful few days, and in fact, I sort of, in a way, I'm sort of semi-convalescing, having ended up falling off a bike and then getting pneumonia and things, but I can't think of a better environment and a better group of people to be with at this time, and I certainly look forward to coming back, perhaps helping the movement of the Isle of Man. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure.
John Surtees at the Mayor's Parlour in Douglas, Isle of Man, 1993.
And finally, one of the most original and entertaining additions to any TT festival was, for many years, the Purple Helmets. And in this nugget of nostalgia, recorded in 2007, Purple Helmet Jim Davidson shares some insider knowledge.
It happened by accident, really. Steve Colley was doing a bit of a show during TT week, and he gets kind of tired. His wrists get tired, and they needed something to fill in. And he was up at the vehicle testing centre at Tremode, and a group of the guys had these Honda 90s and these old army coats, and they decided that, well, maybe we could do a bit of a display just to keep the crowds amused while Steve's having a bit of a rest. And it kind of grew from that, really. It's just year on year we've built new stunts, and first year 95 there was about 10 riders, and it's steadily built up to, at the moment, I think we can regularly rely about 18 to 20 riders.
Yeah.
Mm.
So do people keep wanting to join?
They do, but it's not easy. It's not easy to join, but it's even harder to leave. Once you're in for life. It's not just for Christmas being in the Purple Helmets.
But then you must be, all of you, fairly inventive, because first of all you've got these little, well, the Honda 90s, are they? They're only little bikes. They're carrying a bit of a load, aren't they?
Well, the Honda 90 is absolutely unbelievable. They're almost bulletproof. They really are. I mean, Mr. Honda knew what he was doing when he built those. I mean, it's been voted as being the most successful motorcycle of all time. Yeah. And, of course, for what we use them for, I mean, it's a bit of a spoof thing, really. You know, Honda 90's ladies' shopping bike, and us guys sort of riding around on them, trying to destroy them in all manner of stunts and things that we do. But we ride them in enduros and everything, and they're absolutely unbelievable. They are a really good little bike.
Some of the things you've done with them, I mean, you've had racing wheelie bins, haven't you?
The wheelie bin racing is probably what we're known for, apart from our pyramids, but the wheelie bin racing is great because it's a big spectacle. There's about 10 or 11 wheelie bins, all with different names on them, all dragging around, and it really is racing. There's no hanging around, there's no kind of like playing about. It's full-on racing.
Do you try to add new stunts, or do you rely on your sort of main programme?
We've got our main sort of stunts which we're known for, but each year we strive to think of something topical or something that might be amusing, if you like, for somebody to, you know, for the crowd. And this year for the TT, for the Mad Sunday show, we've got a couple of new stunts. We've got the world's worst magician, and he's going to saw a man in half, so that should be interesting as well. We tend to do topical things, but we push the boundaries as well. I have to say, we do push the boundaries with decency at times, but it's all done with tongue in cheek, and we try not to offend too many people.
Where did these coats come from? You got? Were they from Newson Trading or something? Because they're quite strange, aren't they?
The coats are actually, no, they weren't from Newson. They're Second World War coats. They are. They're from the British Army used them in 1941. It was the Norwegian campaign. They called it. These coats are called Tropal coats. And the buttons, the fastenings on them are quite interesting, because the army boys could actually fasten them up while they were wearing their big gloves because of the Arctic weather. Oh, right. They could fasten them up and unfasten them, but they're absolutely dreadful things. I mean, they're absolutely sweltering hot in the summer and freezing cold when you get any water on them at all. But we think that those coats, since we've had them, they've seen more action than they ever did during World War II. There's no doubt about that, you know. And they are, I'd say, they're almost bulletproof, because only the injuries that the guys have had generally are the bits that hang out of the coat, like arms and legs. The coat, anything that's inside the coat is almost like a protective shield.
And the helmets then, are they purpose made for you?
No, well, we have got some sponsorship deal by a helmet manufacturer who actually gave us the helmet and asked us to wear them, just to have their names on the helmets, really. So that was really good of them, and so we use those when we're doing our displays. I hesitate to ask you about donutting, because I have no idea what it is. Is it respectable? Oh yeah, the donuts. Yeah, it's started off a few years ago, actually, in the Farmer's Arms. We used to go out to the Farmer's Arms when Dougie Christian was the manager out there, and what you do, we would just go into the bar with the bike, and you'd just, well, a wooden floor, and you just put the front brake on and just spin the back wheel and just go round in a circle and leave a black sort of tyre mark in the middle of his floor. We have a bike which has got a smoke machine on it. Dougie was saying, oh, come on, bring the bike, and then bring the... But Mad Sunday this was, full of people, loads of people having their lunch in there and everything, and Dougie was sort of saying, yeah, bring the bike and let's have a donut. So we said, are you sure? Yes, I'm sure. So we brought the bike out, and little did he know it was the smoke machine bike. Well, the smoke machine bike has a button which you press, and it injects diesel directly into the exhaust system. So you can imagine. So halfway around doing the donut, the guy presses the button, the pub filled with smoke. It absolutely filled with smoke. And there was people sitting there eating their Sunday lunch, and they were all coming out the doors carrying their plates with their Sunday lunch on, and the smoke was billowing out upstairs windows. It looked like the place had gone on fire, actually. And it was quite funny. There was like this. And then about 10 minutes later, this guy who had this huge, great bushy beard, it must have been some kind of filtration system, he came out of the door as if nothing had happened, still drinking his pint, wondering why everybody had deserted the pub.
Jim Davidson of the Purple Helmets talking there to David Callister. But I'm afraid that's where we have to park the bike, close the archive room door. And so, until we meet again in the station's nest of nostalgia, this is Judith saying thank you for listening, and I wish you a very good evening.
We are Radio TT, the best biking station in the world.